February 1943. The wind cut through the Urals like a blade, carrying industrial smoke and the metallic taste of steel production across the frozen landscape. Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner stumbled forward in the column of German prisoners, his breath forming crystalline clouds that dissolved instantly in the bitter air. The rhythmic crunch of boots on packed snow had become the soundtrack of their captivity, punctuated only by the distant howl of factory whistles echoing from beyond the white hills. The sound of machinery, a low, constant rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, grew stronger with each kilometer they marched eastward. Klaus had heard that sound before, in the Ruhr Valley, but never with such intensity, never with such relentless persistence that it vibrated through his bones even in sleep. If you're curious about what these German prisoners discovered about Soviet industrial might, stay with us as we uncover this remarkable chapter of World War II history. Chapter 1. The column stretched for nearly 2 kilometers along the rural road, over 800 German soldiers captured during the retreat from Stalingrad. Klaus observed his fellow prisoners from his position near the front, noting how their faces had changed since the surrender 3 weeks ago. The initial shock had given way to a hollow resignation, but underneath, he sensed something else growing, a creeping awareness that their preconceptions about the Soviet Union were crumbling with each passing day. Sergeant Major Heinrich Weber marched beside him, his weathered face set in the same grim expression he'd worn since their capture. Weber had served in the previous war and possessed an uncanny ability to read terrain and assess military situations. During their brief rest stops, he would scan the horizon with the intensity of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. The Soviet guards maintained professional discipline, neither cruel nor particularly kind. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, a compact man in his 30s with intelligent eyes, led their escort. Klaus had noticed how Volkov's gaze would linger on the industrial installations they passed, a hint of something that might have been pride flickering across his features. As they crested a low hill, the source of the mechanical thunder revealed itself. In the valley below, a massive steel complex spread across several square kilometers, its smokestacks reaching toward the gray sky like the fingers of some industrial giant. The facility dwarfed anything Klaus had seen in Germany, its scale seeming almost impossibly vast for a nation they had been told was technologically backward. Weber stopped so suddenly that Klaus nearly collided with him. The sergeant major stood transfixed, his mouth slightly open as he took in the sight before them. The complex bustled with activity despite the war, trains loaded with raw materials arriving at regular intervals, workers moving with purposeful efficiency between buildings, and everywhere the evidence of massive production capacity. The rhythmic pounding of heavy machinery filled the air, a sound so powerful it seemed to make the ground tremble beneath their feet. Klaus recognized the distinctive percussion of drop forges, the kind used for shaping aircraft components and tank parts. But the scale was overwhelming. Dozens of them operating simultaneously, their synchronized impacts creating a mechanical symphony that spoke of industrial power beyond anything in their intelligence briefings. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, not the thin wisps of a struggling economy, but the thick, purposeful emissions of facilities running at full capacity. The acrid smell of coal combustion mixed with the sharper notes of heated metal and industrial chemicals, creating an olfactory signature of serious manufacturing capability. Klaus found his military training automatically cataloging what he observed. The rail infrastructure alone suggested logistical sophistication, multiple parallel tracks, efficient loading facilities, and evidence of standardized operations that spoke to careful planning and abundant resources. This was not the primitive industrial base described in German propaganda. A group of Soviet workers passed near the road, heading toward the morning shift. They moved with the casual confidence of people accustomed to important work, their clothing practical but well-maintained. Klaus noticed their faces, focused, determined, but not downtrodden. These were not the oppressed masses he had expected to find. Weber finally resumed walking, but his pace had slowed. Klaus could see the sergeant major's mind working, recalculating everything he thought he knew about Soviet capabilities. The evidence before them contradicted years of intelligence assessments and propaganda claims about Soviet industrial weakness. The column continued past the complex, but Klaus found himself looking back repeatedly. Each glimpse revealed new details: sophisticated equipment visible through open workshop doors, modern electrical installations, and organizational efficiency that challenged every assumption about Soviet industrial capacity. Volkov noticed their attention and allowed himself a small smile. The Soviet officer understood exactly what the German prisoners were seeing, and Klaus realized that their escort through this industrial heartland was not accidental. This was education, delivered through direct observation rather than lectures or propaganda. As they marched beyond the immediate vicinity of the steelworks, the sound of the drop forges continued to carry on the wind, that rhythmic pounding that would haunt Klaus's thoughts in the days to come. The mechanical thunder followed them for kilometers, a constant reminder of what they had witnessed. Industrial power that made their previous intelligence assessments seem laughably inadequate. The landscape ahead promised more revelations, more challenges to their preconceptions about Soviet capabilities. Klaus felt a growing certainty that their captivity would teach them far more about their enemy than years of military intelligence had ever revealed. The transport train's steel wheels hammered against frozen tracks, creating a rhythmic percussion that had become the soundtrack of captivity for Hauptmann Klaus Weber and 47 other German prisoners. Through barred windows, the Siberian landscape stretched endlessly, white fields interrupted only by dark forests that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Weber pressed his palm against the frosted glass, feeling the cold bite through his threadbare gloves. The metallic taste of recycled air filled his mouth as he watched smokestacks appear in the distance. Tall industrial chimneys piercing the gray sky like monuments to something he couldn't yet comprehend. Magnitogorsk, announced the Soviet guard, his Russian accent thick but understandable. The name meant nothing to most of the prisoners, but Weber had studied enough geography to recognize it as one of Stalin's showcase cities. What he hadn't expected was the scale. The train slowed as they approached what could only be described as an industrial cathedral. Blast furnaces rose like Gothic towers, their tops crowned with flames that painted the snow orange against the twilight. The sound hit them first, a deep, continuous rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, as if the entire region had become a single, breathing machine. Lieutenant Hans Richter, barely 22 and still carrying the arrogance of the Hitler Youth in his posture, scoffed from across the cattle car. Typical Soviet propaganda theater. They're parading us past their few functioning factories. But Weber had spent enough years in industrial management before the war to recognize efficiency when he saw it. The convoy of trucks moving between factory buildings followed precise patterns. Workers in thick winter coats moved with purpose, not the sluggish desperation he'd been told characterized Soviet labor. Steam rose from dozens of points across the complex, suggesting continuous operation even in temperatures that would shut down most German facilities. The metallic percussion of machinery grew louder as their train entered a rail yard that stretched further than some German cities. Freight cars loaded with raw materials formed endless serpentines on parallel tracks. Iron ore, coal, limestone, the basic ingredients of steel production in quantities that made Weber's engineering mind race with calculations. Sergeant Major Ivan Volkov climbed into their car as the train came to a complete stop. Unlike the guards they'd encountered during transport, Volkov carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect rather than demanded it. His weathered face bore the marks of both combat and industrial work, burn scars on his left hand, suggesting familiarity with foundry operations. "You will work here for the duration of your imprisonment," Volkov announced in careful German. "Those with technical knowledge will assist our engineers. Others will learn." Richter's earlier confidence wavered as they were marched through the facility's main entrance. The noise inside was overwhelming, not chaotic, but orchestrated like a massive symphony of productivity. Overhead cranes moved with balletic precision, carrying ladles of molten steel that glowed like captured sunsets. The heat was immediate and welcomed after weeks of transport through Siberian cold. Weber found himself assigned to a production team led by Chief Engineer Dmitry Petrov, a man whose quiet intensity reminded him of his own professors at the Technical University in Munich. Petrov's English was surprisingly fluent, and his questions about German steel production methods came from genuine technical curiosity rather than interrogation protocol. "We produce 8,000 tons daily," Petrov mentioned casually as they walked past the largest blast furnace Weber had ever seen. "This facility alone matches the output of 3 Krupp plants." The number seemed impossible until Weber began observing the operation's rhythm. Shifts changed with military precision. Raw materials arrived in calculated intervals. Quality control happened at multiple stages, not just at the end of production. Everything he'd been taught about Soviet industrial incompetence crumbled with each passing hour. During their first meal break, Weber sat with a group of Russian steelworkers who shared their black bread and thin soup without hostility. Through gestures and basic German phrases, they explained that many had been farmers or craftsmen before the war, rapidly trained and deployed to meet production quotas that would have seemed fantasy in peacetime. Young Alexei, barely older than Richter, had learned foundry operations in 6 months. His hands moved with the confidence of a master craftsman as he demonstrated proper ladle handling techniques. Weber realized this wasn't propaganda or theater. It was systematic transformation of an entire society's productive capacity. That evening, as prisoners were returned to their barracks, Richter approached Weber with questions that revealed his growing uncertainty. "How is this possible, Hauptmann? Our intelligence reports described Soviet industry as primitive, dependent on Western technology." Weber had no answers that wouldn't challenge everything they'd been told about their enemy's capabilities. The metallic percussion of the factory continued through the night, a constant reminder that somewhere beyond their barracks walls, thousands of workers maintained production schedules that operated without pause. The sound followed him into restless sleep, where dreams of German factories seemed suddenly small and distant. Outside, snow continued falling on the industrial complex that sprawled across the horizon like a mechanical city, its chimneys breathing steam into the Siberian night while the war raged thousands of kilometers away. The industrial complex stretched beyond the horizon like a metallic organism breathing steam and smoke into the winter sky. Heinrich Weber stood behind the transport truck's canvas flap, watching smokestacks pierce the gray December morning of 1943. The rhythmic hammering of machinery created a percussion that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, a sound he would carry in his memory for decades. The convoy of German prisoners had been traveling eastward for 3 days, deeper into Soviet territory than most Wehrmacht soldiers had ever imagined possible. Weber pressed his face against the cold metal bars of the truck, his breath forming crystals on the steel. The landscape had transformed from the familiar devastation of battlefields into something entirely unexpected: functioning cities, intact railways, and now this, an industrial heartland that defied everything the Reich's propaganda had taught them about Soviet backwardness. "Mein Gott," whispered Obergefreiter Klaus Richter from the opposite bench. His uniform, once pristine, now bore the stains of captivity and defeat. "Look at the size of those factories." The truck slowed as they approached the entrance to what appeared to be a massive metallurgical complex. Guard towers flanked the gates, and beyond them, Weber could see rail lines carrying freight cars loaded with raw materials. The scale overwhelmed him. During his service with the Sixth Army, he had witnessed the bombing of Soviet industrial targets, but those had been isolated facilities, not this sprawling network of interconnected production centers. Soviet guards directed the convoy through the main gate. Weber noticed the precision of their movements, the maintenance of equipment, the organization that contradicted every briefing he had received about Bolshevik chaos. Steam locomotives pulled endless trains of coal and iron ore along multiple parallel tracks. Workers in heavy coats moved with purpose between buildings that seemed to stretch for kilometers. The metallic hammering grew louder as they passed the main production halls. Through massive windows, Weber glimpsed the orange glow of blast furnaces and the choreographed movement of industrial machinery. He had worked in his father's small tool shop in Bavaria before the war. This was manufacturing on a scale that made German industry appear quaint by comparison. "They told us the Soviets were using pitchforks and horse carts," muttered Unteroffizier Ernst Müller, a veteran of the Moscow offensive. His voice carried the hollow tone of a man confronting the collapse of his worldview. "They told us one good push would bring down their entire system." The truck stopped at a processing center within the industrial complex. Soviet officials in winter uniforms emerged from administrative buildings, carrying clipboards and documentation. Their efficiency struck Weber as thoroughly Germanic in its precision, yet this was supposedly the land of communist disorganization. As the prisoners were processed for work assignments, Weber found himself assigned to a team that would assist in the transportation of manufactured goods. The irony was not lost on him. German prisoners of war would now contribute to the very industrial machine they had been sent to destroy. The metallic hammering continued its relentless rhythm, as Weber was led to temporary barracks within the factory compound. Through the windows, he watched Soviet workers operating machinery that appeared more advanced than equipment he had seen in German factories. Night shifts kept the production lines running continuously, their work illuminated by electric lighting that suggested abundant energy resources. That evening, as Weber lay on his assigned bunk, he reflected on the day's revelations. The Wehrmacht's intelligence had described a primitive agricultural society on the verge of collapse. Instead, he had witnessed an industrial powerhouse capable of sustained production under wartime conditions. The metallic hammering had become a soundtrack to his education in the reality of Soviet capabilities. The other prisoners whispered among themselves in the darkness, sharing observations that contradicted years of Reich propaganda. They had seen telephone lines connecting remote facilities, observed the systematic distribution of resources, witnessed the coordination between civilian and military production that suggested a level of organization they had been told was impossible under communist leadership. Weber closed his eyes, but the sound of machinery continued through the night. Tomorrow would bring his first day as a laborer in the Soviet industrial system, working alongside the people he had been trained to view as subhuman. The metallic hammering would guide him toward a recognition that would reshape his understanding of the war he had fought and lost. The rhythmic clang of machinery echoed through the cavernous factory halls of Nizhny Tagil, each strike of metal against metal marking another moment in the relentless march of Soviet industrial might. February 1943 brought bitter winds that cut through the Ural Mountains, but inside the armaments complex, the heat from blast furnaces created a sweltering cocoon where T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines with mechanical precision. The familiar scent of hot steel and machine oil permeated everything, a metallic perfume that would cling to clothing and memory alike. Klaus Brenner pressed his face closer to the grimy window of the prison transport truck, watching another convoy of freshly manufactured tanks emerge from the facility. The sight struck him with the force of revelation. This was the fourth such factory complex he had witnessed in 3 days of transport deeper into Soviet territory. Each one sprawled across kilometers, smokestacks reaching toward gray skies like the fingers of an industrial giant. Beside him, Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench, his once pristine Wehrmacht uniform now bearing the stains and tears of captivity. The younger soldier had maintained stubborn confidence in German superiority even after their capture at Stalingrad, but his face now bore the slack expression of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth. Through the truck's canvas covering, they glimpsed endless rows of worker housing, each identical block stretching toward horizons that seemed to swallow entire cities. The convoy halted at a railroad junction where freight trains stretched beyond sight, their cars loaded with artillery pieces, aircraft components, and raw materials flowing toward the front lines. A Soviet guard counted the prisoners with practiced efficiency, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he barked orders in Russian. The German prisoners shuffled into formation, their movements stiff from cold and the gradual erosion of military discipline that captivity brought. Brenner observed the Soviet workers with growing fascination. These were not the primitive peasants that German propaganda had portrayed, but skilled technicians operating sophisticated machinery with confident precision. Women worked alongside men, their faces streaked with industrial grime, but their movements sure and purposeful. Children barely old enough to attend school in Germany operated equipment that would have required months of training in Wehrmacht factories. The metallic symphony of production never ceased. Day and night, the factories hummed with activity that defied every assumption Brenner had carried into this war. He remembered the briefings before Operation Barbarossa, the confident predictions that Soviet industrial capacity would crumble under the first sustained assault. Instead, entire factories had been dismantled and moved beyond the Urals, reconstructed and operating at full capacity while German forces still struggled through the approaches to Moscow. Müller finally spoke, his voice barely audible above the mechanical drone. He mentioned seeing aircraft factories producing planes faster than German bombers could destroy them on the ground. The admission carried the weight of personal revelation. This young soldier who had marched east believing in quick victories now faced evidence of an industrial machine that dwarfed anything he had imagined possible. Their destination proved to be a labor camp, adjacent to yet another massive industrial complex, this one specializing in tank production. Guard towers overlooked workshops where prisoners would contribute to the very war machine that had captured them. The irony was not lost on Brenner as he surveyed their new surroundings. German engineering expertise would now serve Soviet industrial might, another component in the relentless production system that stretched from the Urals to the Pacific. As evening approached, the factory whistles announced the end of another shift, but the production lines never truly stopped. New crews arrived to maintain the constant output that fed the Soviet war effort. Brenner watched through the barracks window as maintenance workers swarmed over machinery, ensuring that tomorrow would bring another day of uninterrupted production. The sight filled him with a mixture of professional admiration and personal dread. The familiar scent of hot steel drifted through the camp as night settled over the industrial landscape. In the distance, blast furnaces continued their work, casting orange glows against low clouds that reflected the scope of Soviet manufacturing power. Brenner lay on his wooden bunk, processing the reality that had gradually emerged during their transport eastward. The Third Reich had committed itself to total war against an opponent whose industrial capacity they had fundamentally misunderstood. Mueller turned restlessly on his nearby bunk, whispering observations about the scale of what they had witnessed. Factories that produced more in a single month than German planners had believed possible for an entire year. Supply chains that functioned despite bombing campaigns and territorial losses. A civilian population that had transformed itself into an industrial army with efficiency that matched anything the Wehrmacht had achieved. The weight of this recognition settled over the German prisoners like the Ural winter itself, cold, pervasive, and inescapable. Tomorrow would bring their first day as laborers in the Soviet industrial machine, but tonight brought the more profound realization that they had been captured not just by superior numbers or tactical skill, but by an economic system that had outproduced and outmaneuvered their own. The metallic symphony of Soviet industry continued through the night, each rhythmic strike against steel marking another nail in the coffin of German hopes for quick victory in the east. The metallic screech of train wheels against steel rails pierced the December air as the transport finally lurched to a halt. Steam hissed from the locomotive's valves, mixing with the prisoners' visible breath in the sub-zero temperatures of the Ural industrial heartland. Through the cattle car's wooden slats, Klaus caught his first glimpse of something that would shatter every assumption he held about Soviet capabilities. Massive smokestacks rose like cathedral spires against the gray sky, their tops crowned with columns of dense smoke that painted the horizon black. The rhythmic pounding of industrial hammers created a percussion that seemed to make the very ground tremble beneath their feet. This was Magnitogorsk, Stalin's crown jewel of industrial might, and the German prisoners were about to witness something their Wehrmacht intelligence reports had never prepared them for. Sergeant Mueller pressed his face against the gap in the wooden planks, his weathered features reflecting disbelief. The scale defied comprehension. Furnaces stretched beyond the visible horizon, their orange glow casting dancing shadows across snow-covered rail yards filled with more freight cars than he had seen in all of Germany. The acrid smell of molten steel mixed with coal smoke created an atmosphere so thick it seemed to coat the inside of his throat. Officer Hoffman stood rigid beside the car door, his military bearing intact despite 3 weeks of captivity. His trained eye cataloged what he observed with the precision of a reconnaissance report. Blast furnaces operating at full capacity, rail infrastructure that dwarfed anything in the Reich, and most troubling of all, the steady stream of workers moving between facilities with the efficiency of a perfectly orchestrated machine. The prisoners were herded from the transport cars in groups of 50, their boots crunching through snow mixed with iron ore dust. Soviet guards, wrapped in thick gray coats, directed them with gestures rather than words. The language barrier mattered little when the industrial symphony around them spoke volumes about their captors' true strength. As they marched through the facility's outer perimeter, Klaus found himself mesmerized by the sight of molten steel flowing like lava through massive channels. Sparks erupted in brilliant cascades each time the liquid metal met its molds, creating momentary fireworks against the perpetual twilight of industrial smoke. The heat radiating from the furnaces created pockets of warmth that the prisoners instinctively gravitated toward, despite their guards' efforts to maintain formation. Private Weber, barely 19 and captured during the retreat from Moscow, stumbled as his eyes tracked the movement of a massive crane lifting what appeared to be a complete tank turret. His unit had spent months hearing about Soviet equipment shortages, about an enemy running on outdated machinery, and desperate improvisation. the reality before them suggested something entirely different, a production capacity that seemed to dwarf even Germany's most optimistic wartime estimates. The grinding sound of machinery operating around the clock filled every pause and conversation among the prisoners. Unlike the factories back home, which had grown increasingly quiet as materials became scarce, this Soviet complex hummed with the constant activity of abundant resources and uninterrupted production schedules. Conveyor systems moved raw materials with mechanical precision, while overhead, the skeletal framework of new construction projects reached toward the sky. Hoffman's military mind began calculating production rates based on what he could observe. The number of completed artillery pieces visible in just one storage area exceeded his regiment's entire complement of heavy weapons. Rail cars loaded with tanks moved through the facility with the frequency of civilian passenger service, each carrying equipment that appeared not just functional but technologically sophisticated. The metallic screech that had announced their arrival now became a constant backdrop as more transport trains delivered raw materials and departed with finished military hardware. The sound triggered something in Klaus's memory, his father's stories about German industrial might during the Great War, tales of factories that never slept, and production lines that could supply entire armies. Yet even those legendary facilities seemed modest compared to the Soviet achievement spreading before them. As evening approached, the prisoners were assigned to temporary barracks within sight of the main production facilities. Through frost-covered windows, they watched shift changes that brought fresh workers to maintain 24-hour operations. The efficiency of the transition impressed even Sergeant Muller, whose peacetime experience managing a machine shop had given him appreciation for industrial organization. That night, lying on thin mattresses while the distant hammering of steel continued, conversations among the prisoners carried undertones of profound uncertainty. Everything they had been told about Soviet backwardness crumbled against the evidence of their own eyes. The propaganda they had internalized about fighting a technologically inferior enemy now seemed not just wrong, but dangerously naive. Hoffman found sleep elusive as he processed the strategic implications of what they had witnessed. If one facility could produce at such scales, how many others existed across the vast Soviet territory? How had German intelligence so completely misjudged their enemy's industrial capacity? The questions multiplied without answers, each one adding weight to a growing realization that the war they thought they understood had been built on fundamental miscalculations. The metallic screech of another arriving transport echoed through the barracks, carrying with it fresh uncertainty about what revelations the coming days might bring. The factory floor stretched beyond what Heinrich's eyes could process, a cathedral of steel and steam that seemed to breathe with mechanical precision. Conveyor belts carried tank hulls through assembly stations where sparks cascaded like metallic rain. The rhythmic hammering of pneumatic tools created a symphony that vibrated through his worn boots, up through his spine, settling in his chest like a permanent echo. Kurt stood motionless beside him, mouth slightly agape. The mathematics teacher from Dresden had calculated artillery trajectories for 3 years, but the sheer scale before them defied every assumption he'd held about Soviet industrial capacity. Rows of T-34 tanks emerged from the production line with clockwork regularity, one every 18 minutes, according to the supervisor who'd led them through the Stalingrad complex. 12,000 completed last month alone, Dmitri mentioned casually, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. The Soviet foreman treated these statistics like weather reports, mundane facts that required no particular emphasis. His calloused fingers gestured toward the welding stations where women in headscarves operated equipment that would have required specialized technicians back in the Ruhr Valley. The prisoner transport had arrived at Chelyabinsk 3 days earlier, February 1943. Heinrich remembered his last glimpse of German panzers, disabled hulks scattered across the Stalingrad approaches, their steel already claimed by winter and Soviet artillery. Now he witnessed their replacements rolling off assembly lines at a pace that transformed desperation into something approaching mathematical certainty. Anna Kozlova moved between workstations with practiced efficiency, her clipboard recording production numbers that would eventually reach Moscow's planning committees. She had relocated from Leningrad 18 months earlier when the factory evacuated westward, bringing machinery and expertise beyond German bombing range. Her younger brother served somewhere near Kursk. His letters arrived sporadically, carrying news of German equipment shortages and declining morale. The metallic tang of heated steel mixed with lubricating oils created an atmosphere thick enough to taste. Heinrich found himself thinking of the Krupp foundries, remembering tours during his engineering studies when Germany's industrial might seemed unquestionable. Those memories felt increasingly distant as he observed Soviet production methods that emphasized quantity and reliability over the precision craftsmanship he'd been taught to worship. Output increased 40% since January, Dmitry continued, leading the group past a station where armor plating received final inspections. Workers volunteered for extra shifts after news from the Southern Front arrived. Many have relatives serving in tank units. Kurt scribbled calculations on a scrap of paper, his engineer's mind processing. Implications. If these numbers represented just one facility among dozens scattered across the Urals, then German intelligence estimates had been catastrophically inadequate. The prisoner exchange program intended to demonstrate Soviet industrial weakness was achieving precisely the opposite effect. Heinrich noticed details that would have escaped casual observation: the efficiency of material flow, the integration of assembly processes, the absence of bottlenecks that typically plagued rapid production increases. This wasn't improvised wartime manufacturing. The infrastructure suggested years of systematic preparation, as if Soviet planners had anticipated this moment long before German armies crossed the border. A whistle signaled shift change. Workers filed past the prisoner group without particular interest. Their conversations focused on production quotas and family news, rather than the spectacle of captured Germans witnessing their own strategic doom. Heinrich found their indifference more unsettling than hostility would have been. The hammering sound followed them as Dmitry led the group toward the administrative building. Heinrich realized this rhythmic percussion had become the soundtrack to his captivity, present during morning formations, audible through barracks walls, echoing in his dreams. It represented something beyond mere industrial noise, the mechanical heartbeat of a nation that had absorbed devastating losses and responded by transforming its entire geography into a weapon. Outside, February wind carried smoke from dozens of factory chimneys across the Ural landscape. Heinrich could see additional facilities under construction on distant hills, their skeletal frameworks promising even greater production capacity. The Soviet Union was building its future while Germany's industrial base faced Allied bombing campaigns that grew more devastating each month. "Tomorrow you will observe the artillery production facility," Dmitry announced as they approached the gate. "Output there has tripled since last autumn. Quite impressive, even by our standards." The hammering continued behind them, relentless and precise, marking time in a war whose outcome seemed increasingly determined by factors Heinrich had never learned to calculate. The metallic screech of train wheels against frozen tracks pierced the December air as the transport convoy approached Novosibirsk's industrial district. Klaus Richter pressed his face against the barred window of the cattle cur, watching towering smokestacks emerge from the Siberian horizon like cathedral spires made of steel and concrete. The year 1943 had brought him to this moment, from the Wehrmacht's 6th Army at Stalingrad to this rolling prison crossing the heart of Soviet territory. Hundreds of German prisoners shuffled in formation through the railway yard, their breath forming crystalline clouds in the -30 air. The guards' orders echoed across the platform in harsh Russian syllables, but Klaus found himself mesmerized by something else entirely. Beyond the barbed wire perimeter, massive industrial complexes stretched toward the horizon, factory halls longer than entire city blocks, with endless rows of windows glowing amber in the winter twilight. Sergeant Werner Hoffmann, marching 2 rows behind Klaus, kept his eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath his boots. The sound of hammering, rhythmic, persistent, mechanical, had followed them for the past hour as their train wound through the industrial zone. It reminded him of his father's blacksmith shop in Bavaria, but magnified 1,000-fold into something that defied comprehension. Each strike seemed to reverberate through his chest, a metallic heartbeat of a nation he had been taught to despise. The procession halted before a massive gate marked with Cyrillic letters. Major Dmitry Volkov, the camp commandant, stood reviewing documents on a clipboard while steam rose from a tin cup in his gloved hands. His uniform bore the crisp edges of someone who had never seen the front lines, yet his eyes carried the weight of administrative burdens that extended far beyond managing prisoners. Behind him, the Kuznetsk metallurgical combine's blast furnaces painted the evening sky in shades of orange and crimson. Klaus counted the smokestacks visible through the fence. 14, 15, 16. before losing track in the forest of industrial towers. Each one belched steady streams of smoke and steam, creating artificial clouds that merged with the natural overcast. The sheer scale challenged everything he thought he knew about Soviet capabilities. German intelligence had painted the USSR as a backward agricultural nation, barely capable of feeding its own population. A prisoner near the front of the line stumbled, his legs buckling from exhaustion and cold. The guards barked orders, but Klaus noticed something unexpected in their voices. Not cruelty, but the mechanical efficiency of men following established procedures. The fallen soldier was helped to his feet by two comrades, then escorted to a separate building. No violence, no theatrical brutality, just the administrative management of human resources on an industrial scale. The hammering grew louder as they approached. The camp's main entrance. Klaus realized the sound originated from construction sites scattered throughout the complex. New barracks, additional workshops, expanded facilities. Even in winter, in wartime, in the depths of Siberia, the Soviet machine continued expanding. Workers in quilted jackets moved between building sites, their movements purposeful despite the brutal cold. Major Volkov folded his documents and addressed the prisoners in broken German. His words were functional, devoid of ideology or hatred. Work assignments would begin tomorrow. Food rations would be distributed according to productivity quotas. Medical examinations would commence at dawn. The speech lasted 3 minutes, long enough to convey essential information, brief enough to minimize exposure to the freezing air. As the prisoners were divided into groups of 50, Klaus found himself assigned to Factory Section C, aircraft engine components. The irony was not lost on him. 6 months ago, he had been loading shells into an 88mm gun, targeting Soviet aircraft. Now he would help produce the engines that powered them. The circular logic of war had delivered him to this moment with mathematical precision. Sergeant Hoffman ended up in the same work detail, a small mercy in the vast machinery of captivity. They were housed in Barracks 12, a long wooden structure that smelled of pine resin and human occupancy. 48 bunks arranged in precise rows with narrow aisles between them. The heating system, actual central heating, not just wood stoves, surprised Klaus with its efficiency. That first evening, lying on his thin mattress, Klaus listened to the industrial symphony outside. The hammering had given way to the steady hum of generators, the distant clang of metal against metal, the rhythmic chuff of steam engines. It was the sound of a nation at work, 24 hours a day, transforming raw materials into instruments of war with relentless efficiency. The next morning brought Klaus face to face with the reality behind the statistics. Factory Section C occupied a building the size of 3 aircraft hangars, filled with precision machinery that would not have looked out of place in Krupp's best facilities. Soviet workers operated lathes and milling machines with practiced expertise, producing engine components to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Klaus was assigned to quality control, examining finished parts for defects, measuring dimensions, recording production data. The work supervisor, a woman named Vera Petrovna, demonstrated the inspection procedures with the patience of someone who had trained hundreds of workers. Her hands moved with mechanical precision across each component, detecting flaws that would have escaped Klaus's untrained eye. The production quotas were posted on a board near the entrance. Daily targets, weekly summaries, monthly objectives. The numbers told a story of industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Klaus had imagined. This single factory section produced more engine components in a month than some German facilities managed in a quarter. And this was just one section, in one factory, in one industrial city among dozens scattered across the Soviet Union. During the midday break, Klaus walked to the factory's edge and gazed across the industrial landscape. The Kuznetsk complex stretched beyond the horizon. Steel mills, chemical plants, power stations, transportation networks. Thousands of workers moved between facilities like blood cells through arteries, carrying raw materials in and finished products out. The scale defied human comprehension. That evening, Sergeant Hoffman shared his own observations from the foundry section. Temperature controls precise to single degrees. Alloy compositions mixed to exact specifications. Production schedules coordinated across multiple shifts. The Soviets had built an industrial infrastructure that operated with German-level precision, but on a scale that made the Ruhr Valley look like a workshop. The hammering returned that night, echoing across the camp, as construction crews worked under floodlights. Klaus realized it was not just the sound of building. It was the sound of a civilization transforming itself through sheer industrial will. Every strike drove another nail into the coffin of German assumptions about Soviet capabilities. Weeks passed in mechanical routine, wake at dawn, factory work until evening, meals calculated to sustain productivity. Klaus found himself developing an almost scientific fascination with the system surrounding him. The Soviets had created something unprecedented, an entire society organized around industrial production, with every citizen, every institution, every decision subordinated to the goal of manufacturing power. The hammering had become a constant companion, marking time like a mechanical metronome. It was the sound of Klaus's old certainties being demolished, one strike at a time, and something new being constructed in their place. As winter deepened and production quotas were met with methodical consistency, he began to understand that the war's outcome had been decided not in the trenches of Stalingrad, but in factories like this one, scattered across the vastness of the Soviet Union. The steel mills of Magnitogorsk stretched beyond the horizon, their smokestacks piercing the March sky of 1943. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wagner stood at the factory gates, watching molten iron flow in rivers of orange fire through channels carved in concrete. The rhythmic hammering of drop forges echoed across the Ural Mountains like artillery, but this was different. This was creation, not destruction. The prisoners had been marching for 6 days since leaving the temporary camp near Chelyabinsk. Wagner's boots, now cracked leather, held together by wire, left prints in the industrial soot that coated every surface. Around him, 300 German soldiers moved in loose formation, their faces bearing the same expression of stunned disbelief that had followed them across the Soviet Union. Commandant Volkov gestured toward a massive blast furnace, its mouth glowing like a primordial cave. Workers in felt boots and quilted jackets moved with practiced efficiency, manipulating levers that controlled flows of material Wagner could barely comprehend. The scale defied everything his training had taught him about Soviet capabilities. "Production here exceeds Essen," Volkov announced in his precise German, consulting a leather-bound ledger. 32 furnaces operate continuously. Each produces 400 tons daily. Wagner calculated silently. The numbers strained credibility. In the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, such output required multiple facilities spread across dozens of cities. Here, in the middle of nowhere, beyond the Urals where his map showed only wilderness, stood a complex that dwarfed anything he had seen in the Reich. The bitter metallic taste of iron particles coated his tongue. Every breath carried the weight of industrial might that had somehow materialized in this remote corner of Siberia. His fingers found the small piece of shrapnel in his pocket, the same fragment that had torn through his uniform at Stalingrad, that had accompanied his capture, his transport, his growing awareness that everything he had believed was wrong. Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann approached, his face streaked with the red dust that seemed to emanate from every surface. "Herr Oberleutnant, the men are asking questions I cannot answer." Wagner nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. For months, they had witnessed collective farms mechanized beyond German rural standards, saw cities where their intelligence maps showed empty steppes, encountered industrial complexes that produced materials in quantities that made their homeland's output seem modest by comparison. "Tell them what we see is what exists," Wagner replied quietly. "Nothing more, nothing less." A locomotive whistle pierced the air, and Wagner turned to watch a freight train approach the factory's rail terminus. The cars stretched beyond his vision, hundreds of them, loaded with coal from mines whose existence German intelligence had never detected, carrying raw materials to feed industrial appetites that planners in Berlin had never imagined. The train's rhythm reminded him of the artillery barrage at Stalingrad, the endless percussion that had announced their defeat. But this rhythm spoke of construction, of processes that operated beyond military timeframes, of capacity built not for war, but for transformation on a scale that rendered military conquest meaningless. Volkov opened his ledger again, pointing to columns of figures. This facility began production in 1932, 5 years to build what took your country decades to develop. His voice carried no boasting, only the flat precision of an engineer reciting specifications. Wagner studied the numbers, cross-referencing them with his memory of German industrial reports. The mathematics were undeniable. While Germany had concentrated on military production, Sacrificing civilian industry to feed its war machine, the Soviets had built an industrial base that could produce both guns and butter, tanks and tractors, in quantities that made German efforts appear narrow and ultimately self-defeating. The shrapnel in his pocket seemed heavier now, its sharp edges a reminder of the battlefield where these revelations had begun. At Stalingrad, he had faced Soviet tanks produced in factories he had never heard of, fought soldiers equipped by industrial complexes his intelligence services had never located, confronted an enemy whose resources seemed to multiply rather than diminish under pressure. Young Gefreiter Franz Müller joined them, his eyes wide with the same expression Wagner had seen on every prisoner's face since their journey began. "Sir, how did we not know? How did none of our reports mention this?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the blast furnaces. Wagner remembered briefings in Berlin where Soviet industrial capacity was dismissed as primitive, agricultural, incapable of sustained modern production. Those assessments now seem not merely wrong but catastrophically blind to realities that stood before them in steel and concrete. "We knew what we chose to know," Wagner said finally. "We saw what confirmed what we already believed." A shift change brought thousands of workers streaming through the factory gates. Men and women in identical quilted jackets, their faces bearing the satisfied exhaustion of completed quotas, moved past the German prisoners without curiosity or hostility. They were builders, Wagner realized, participants in a transformation that transcended military ambitions. The evening light cast long shadows across the industrial complex, revealing the true scope of what had been built in this remote location. Blast furnaces, rolling mills, foundries, chemical plants, an integrated system that transformed Rotha's Siberian resources into finished goods, that operated according to plans measured not in military campaigns but in decades of development. Volkov closed his ledger and gestured toward the setting sun. "Tomorrow you will see the aluminum smelters. Next week, the aircraft factories. Your education in Soviet reality continues." As they walked back toward their temporary barracks, Wagner felt the shrapnel one final time. The metal fragment had traveled with him from the moment of defeat to this moment of understanding. It had witnessed his capture, his transport across a continent, his growing comprehension that the war had been lost not on battlefields, but in planning rooms where Soviet capabilities had been consistently underestimated. The piece of shrapnel now seemed less like a wound and more like a key, unlocking recognition of a truth that would reshape his understanding of everything that had happened, everything that would happen next. The German prisoners had been shocked not by Soviet industrial power, but by their own ignorance of it, by the systematic blindness that had led them to underestimate an enemy whose strength lay not in military tradition, but in the patient construction of productive capacity on a scale that made conquest irrelevant. The smokestacks of Magnitogorsk continued their endless emission into the Siberian night, marking the rhythm of production that would outlast any military campaign, any political system, any individual ambition. Wagner finally understood that he had not been defeated by superior tactics or greater numbers, but by a different conception of power itself, one that built rather than conquered, that created rather than destroyed, that measured strength in tons of steel rather than kilometers of territory. The war was over, and the future belonged to those who had learned to build it.